I'm a little bit of a control freak when it comes to ISO. On most of my cameras, I'm always choosing it based on the environment, and I don't really like auto ISO. However, I am going to try to embrace auto ISO using my Fujifilm cameras, and the reason is I'm a little lazy. You get a little lazy, and it's actually more important when you walk around to see composition and to see light instead of fumbling through your settings and kind of trying to figure out what ISO is perfect for the scene. So today I'm gonna kind of figure out what the best settings are for my Fujifilm. But before I do that, I need to kind of figure out a couple of things before I just jump into auto ISO like a maniac. So the first thing I need to figure out is, what is the highest ISO that I'm willing to tolerate? All right, so to figure out my high ISO tolerance, the first thing I needed to do was I set my camera to shoot both JPEG and RAW. That's first. Number two, I took test photos of my best friend Hulk here at the lowest ISO, 200, which is obviously very safe and clean as kind of the control group. And then I went 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 64, and then the highest one. Now, because I don't like how the Fujifilm cameras do noise reduction, the pictures kind of get a little waxy. I have my noise reduction down to -4. You might want to do that as well. We all are a little different. So decide what you want to do with that. But I took all noise reduction out, and I wanted to see what kind of grain would show up in the JPEG files. I also did the test in very good light using my Godox light here, but also in poor light. Just know that if you're using higher ISOs with any camera and you need to recover some exposure later, the higher the ISO, the more grain and noise you're gonna get. So just be aware that if you're shooting at higher ISOs, you should be trying to get the exposure correct in camera so that when you try to save the photo later, it's not a disaster. Now, I always shoot RAW and JPEG anyway, but I wanted to look at the JPEGs and see what my tolerance was for that. And looking at all the Hulk photos and then also checking Spidey in the background, I kind of was like definitely safe. 200, 400, 800, and 1600 to me were all totally usable, totally clean. And so I had to decide what my tolerance was. 3200, 6400. I kept going back and forth between those two. Now we're talking JPEG still. I'll talk about RAW in a second. But I've decided that my sort of clean settings for ISO on a JPEG, like I want a clean file, 1600 for my Fujifilm X-T2 is 1600. However, usable ISOs on a JPEG, I felt that 3200 and 6400 were fine and great. 12,800 I would not use for a JPEG. 6400 was giving me a little bit of angst on a JPEG. So I would say 3200 totally comfortable with, where 16 and down were clean to me. 3200 fine, 6400 I could live with, but I want to stay away from. These are all personal preferences. You have to do this test and decide what your high ISO tolerance is. Now, if you're shooting RAW, it becomes a completely different beast because there's software, there's noise reduction, there's emergency sort of techniques that if you get the most epic shot ever on the street and you shot it at 12,800, that you could save it and it could be clean and it could be sharp. Now, you could use noise reduction in Lightroom and Capture One, and they're fine, but there's this software called Topaz Noise Reduction, or I'm just like blown away by the voodoo that this can do to a RAW file. I shot Hulk at 12,800 and used the Denoise by Topaz, and totally worth the money. If you get the most epic shot at 12,800 RAW file, you can make it look like ISO 400 or even ISO 200. It's incredible. So with techniques you can save. Now, I don't want to do that. That's part of the point of this, is I want to use an auto ISO that gets it kind of right in camera without having to save photographs. That's not the point. But I just wanted to point out that you could shoot your Fujifilm cameras at full max ISO in an emergency situation, and there's software that can make it look like lower ISOs. All right, step 2 of the process is to decide what your minimum shutter speed is for hand holding. Because when you're in auto ISO, the camera will choose a shutter speed for you, and you need to make sure that you don't have images with, shake, with camera shake. So the next thing you need to do is, if nothing's moving in the photograph and you're trying to take a picture of something, what's your lowest comfortable shutter speed? What you need to know, by the way, it's different for each lens. The longer the lens, the harder it is to hand hold, which means you need a higher shutter speed. So I tested it with the 35mm f2. That's a very general sort of focal length. And I found that I could hand hold around 1/40th, 1/35th. And one general rule, if you have a focal length, is that your shutter speed should be around 1/8 or 1/double to be safe. So about 1/60th for this 135 is pretty good. So I found for things that aren't moving, 1/60th of a second is pretty safe for most of my lenses, even the 56 1.2. So I'm keeping that as the minimum shutter speed. Now for my auto ISO settings, I have three kind of main things in my mind. The first one is there's no movement and I can hand hold the lens. Auto ISO number 2 is gonna be my general purpose, decent shutter speed to stop most motion. And the last one is emergency situation where I just gonna pick the highest ISO and the highest shutter speed and hope for the best. Okay, so let's set up our auto ISOs here. And the first thing I want to do is actually set a custom button that will always be active in case I need to change my auto ISO quickly. So hold the display back button. And what you want to do is choose a custom button that you'd like to change. And I've chosen the right side here. And on the right side, I've made that you can go to ISO auto setting and hit OK. And now if I go to the right, I can actually choose between 3 banks. So for the first auto ISO, I kind of just want to make it a very clean, a very safe, and a no motion setting. So there's no running, no bicycles. So for default, I'm going to pick the lowest ISO. And for the max, I'm going to pick the cleanest. I really want like a super clean file. So I'm comfortable at about 1600. And I already know the minimum shutter speed that I can hand hold the lens is about 60 for most of my lenses. For my number two is going to be a general purpose. I'm pretty comfortable with 6400 without having to do any saving or recovery of the file. Decide what your comfort shutter speed is for your Auto 2. Okay, and Auto 3 is emergency land. You definitely want to get the shot because of the shutter speed. There's maybe something coming, a bicycle or someone running, or you just want a safer shutter speed. And here I'm planning just to get the shot, and I could just worry about recovering noise and recovering anything in software later if the shot is super epic. All right, so let's see how the camera behaves with the auto ISO. So the first step is to put your ISO wheel on A, or if you don't have an auto ISO wheel, just jump in the menu and put it on auto ISO. And I'm gonna shoot aperture priority, which is one of the reasons to shoot auto ISO, is that the camera will pick the shutter speed for you. And so now the only control I have available to me is the aperture. So if I need shallow depth of field, I can stay at f2. And also, if I want everything in focus, I could be f8, f11. The other nice thing about the aperture wheel is that if you're shooting at, let's say, f5.6 or f4, and you find that the shutter speed is too slow for the auto ISO, you can just open up your lens a little bit, and that will let in more light, and it'll actually increase your shutter speed. So you're actually using the iris on the lens to give you more shutter speed or less shutter speed. Now let's say we want to stop down our aperture to 5.6 on our lens. If you notice, the camera has picked the highest ISO that you chose for auto ISO 1, 1600, but it also is disobeying your slowest shutter speed because it does need to actually, expose the photograph. So it will break the rules. So with auto ISO, you do need to keep an eye on your shutter speed. And what you can do in this case is you can actually either change your auto ISO to something else, but really you should just kind of open up your lens. And this could open up your lens to a shutter speed you're more comfortable hand holding. and then you could take the shot. Okay, auto ISO 2, which is our general purpose. With the lighting in this room, I have a general purpose shutter speed of 200, 250. If I open up to 2.0, the camera goes up to 320 and gives me an ISO of 2500. Now, by the way, if you're not pushing down on the shutter, it will show sometimes the maximum, and you have to half hold to meter. Now, let's say I stop my lens down to f8. If I half hold the shutter, now we've picked the maximum, 6400 ISO, and the shutter also has broken the rule there. So you might want to play with your aperture to get to a shutter that's more comfortable for the situation. And last emergency. If we have our emergency ISO here, again, it didn't pick my maximum shutter. Let's open up to f2. Here it picked my maximum shutter at ISO 5000, which is great. I could get the shot. Now, if you're shooting action or sports or something that requires a faster shutter speed, I wouldn't use auto ISO because the max ISO is 1/500th, and you might need shutter speeds that are higher than that. In those cases, I would get out of auto ISO and actually pick the shutter speeds that you need, 1000, 2000, 4000, let's say, and then adjust your ISO accordingly. All right, now you have your high ISO tolerance, what you could put up with. You have how you can handhold your lens, what's the minimum shutter speed, and now you can control your photography just using your aperture and look for things like composition and lighting and let the camera do most of the work. All right, I'll see you guys next time. I don't know why I ended the video that way.